The commercial revolution is the next topic in our exploration of the European world. Let's get started by looking back at some of what we know about trade, and particularly the Asian trade routes that we've seen earlier in the year. As you can see on this chart, it says Asian trade routes had dominated global trade prior to 1500, with West Asia acting as a sort of middleman between East and West. So if I look at this map, what I'll see over here on the right is I'll see China and its major importance along the Silk Road. There's Xi'an, right? And along the city of Xi'an or Chang'an, you can see that the road split across the northern part of Central Asia, and you can also see that the road went sort of a southwesterly way towards the Gupta Empire of India. You can also see that that road connects with other roads that eventually lead through Persia and make their way all the way over to the Mediterranean Sea towards Rome. In addition to that, you can see that there are trade routes that go through the Persian Gulf and go around the Arabian Peninsula and across to the Red Sea over here in Egypt. And in addition to that, you can see that there are trade routes that go all the way around India by sea and across the Bay of Bengal in two different ways through Southeast Asia, again across land in this case, and over here by sea through what we call the Straits of Malacca near Singapore, and then go up the coast again towards China. So there's all sorts of trade routes here, and these trade routes really, these old world trade routes really dominated global trade. Again, Asia, Central Asia, and what we would call West Asia, or today we call it the Middle East, is essentially where all the global trade was taking place. Now that's all prior to 1500. If I look at this, when we look at early explorations in the East, we'll see that the first Europeans to sort of make their way towards Asia to trade were in fact the Portuguese, and then later followed by the Spanish. And in this case, you can see they're leaving Portugal. They're going along the coast of West Africa, making their way down to the Cape of Good Hope, which is the tip of Africa, going around, exploring the area between Madagascar and East Africa, and then crossing over to India. And so this was all prior to 1700. So Europeans in this case were motivated to head east in order to bypass West Asia. And again, West Asia, the Middle East, was essentially the middleman for trade along the earlier trade routes that went across water and land. And so Europeans wanted to cut out that middleman, and to do so they had to get past it. The best way to do it in this case was to go around Africa. Now, Columbus had a very similar idea, except instead of going south and around Africa, he thought it would be just as easy to head west. He thought the world was actually smaller than it was, so he didn't think the trip would be that long. What he didn't know is it was much bigger, and that there were a couple of continents there that he hadn't planned on. So again, Columbus will eventually be trying to get to this area where Japan and Korea is. He's looking for the archipelago of Japan, okay, as he's trying to get close to China. And you can see in this case, based on Columbus's exploration and other explorers that followed him, again, he went from Europe, in this case from about the location of Spain, and he did eventually make his way to this archipelago of islands here, which we today call Hispaniola and eventually Cuba. He thought he was in Japan, but it wasn't. It's a different archipelago, but it's essentially where he thought he would find Japan. Again, he didn't know that North America and South America would be sitting there. So between 1492 with Columbus and 1682, you can see a significant number of Spanish, Portuguese, French, English, and Dutch explorers were trading along these Atlantic sea routes. What's really interesting here is you're beginning to see that trade routes are shifting. The major trade routes from this time period will be across the Atlantic Ocean, not across Central Asia, not across the Silk Road, not through India, and not through the Middle East anymore. And shipping and water traffic is the way by which the global trade routes begin to sort of reshape themselves, not the old world trade routes that we saw with land routes across Asia and the sea routes that went around China and India. Okay, so what is the Columbian Exchange? It's what we call this global transfer of foods, plants, and animals that took place during the colonization of the Americas. And of course, it starts in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue and ended up in the Americas and had access to things and products and plants that he had never seen before. All right, so this global exchange would actually transform the world. And here's Columbus, and that's why it's called the Columbian Exchange. And again, it's a global transfer of plants, animals, diseases in some cases, and especially food. And in many cases, it went both ways. So this would bring together both the Eastern and Western hemispheres, right? So again, the Eastern hemisphere being the Old World, and the Western hemisphere being North and South America. All right, and it touched nearly all the peoples of the world. So all the people of the old world as well as the people of the new world. And yeah, it touched them in good ways and bad ways too. For some people there were benefits, and obviously for Europeans and for Native Americans there weren't that many benefits because many of them end up dying from disease. Okay, so take a look at this map. This is a map that comes right out of your book. It's called the Columbian Exchange. And what I'd like you to do is, if you have your journals handy, is copy any 10 items from the list from each side and put them into your journal pages for me. And so you can see that the products that are coming from the Americas and going to Europe, Africa, and Asia include corn, tomatoes, vanilla beans, potatoes, peanuts, cocoa beans, pineapple, peppers, avocado, sweet potato, squash, turkey, pumpkins, tobacco, and even quinine for medicine. And on the right, you can see stuff actually went from Europe and Africa and Asia all the way to the Americas. So things like citrus fruits, grapes, bananas, sugarcane, even the honeybee, peaches, coffee beans, turnips, olives, and onions. That's all old world stuff that actually ends up in the new world. And you've got different kinds of grains like wheat, rice, barley, and oats. You got cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses, and then a whole host of diseases, with smallpox being one of the worst ones, but a whole host of others. The problem with that was many Native Americans did not have any biological resistance to these diseases, and as a result, most of them were wiped out by them. In addition, too, think about those grains. We think of America as the breadbasket of the world with, the grain and wheat that grows in the central part of the United States and basically feeds everybody on the planet. If you came to America before 1492, there was no wheat. There was nothing there. It was actually open prairie lands for buffalo, but there certainly wasn't any wheat there. All of that stuff is the product of people bringing new plants over. Another thing that's actually interesting too is the tomato. If you think about Italy, before Columbus discovered the New World, there were no tomatoes in Europe, so Italians couldn't have had spaghetti sauce. And also, if you think about noodles, before Marco Polo went to China, there were no noodles in Italy. So I'm not quite sure what people in Italy were eating at that time period. So it's something interesting to consider. Let's take a look at what capitalism is, because this is a new economic system that emerges during this time period. Capitalism is an economic system that's based on private ownership and the investment of wealth for profit. Now, this is something you're probably familiar with because we live in a capitalist society. But keep in mind, in the 1500s, this was a new idea to people, and they had never thought of it before. So here's how the rise of capitalism takes place. First of all, let's say you're going to create some overseas colonization and trade, and that will help make merchants a little bit more wealthy. So what has to happen is that merchants are going to continue to invest their money in trade and overseas exploration. So the idea is you set up a colony, you set up an overseas colony so that you can trade, make money, and make some wealth. Then what you do is with the wealth that you've gained from that is you're going to continue to invest that same money into more trade and more overseas exploration. So remember, this is important for capitalism. You make money, but you don't spend it, you reinvest it. And that's exactly what these guys did. Then the profits from these investments are going to enable merchants and traders to reinvest even more money in other enterprises. So once you've made a lot of money off of overseas colonization and exploration, you can then invest in other types of industries or other types of ventures. So this will make business across Europe grow and flourish. So this idea that you make money, you invest money, you then take a risk, you earn the money that you've made, you reinvest it into another venture, and it should continue to make you more profit as long as everything goes well. That's essentially how the rise of capitalism took place in Europe. Pretty simple way of looking at it. Okay, how did this take place? They had to create what was known as the joint stock company. It worked much like a modern-day corporation in which you buy stock in a company, and hopefully if the company does well, the stock will increase in its value. Now, it involves a number of people pooling their wealth for a common purpose. So, for instance, if I want to create a colony, I can't afford to do that by myself. That's just way too expensive. But if 100 people or 200 people get together, we might be able to pool our resources together to buy the ships, the supplies, and pay the people that need to go do the work for us. And that colony might actually thrive. But no single individual could actually afford to do the colony by itself. They had to actually work together with other people to pool their wealth together. Now, there are risks and benefits that are involved. Here's the risks. many ships never completed the long and dangerous ocean voyage. So in those days, storms would wipe out ships, they'd be lost at sea, and you could lose all your money in that case. So, or the colony could fail, and like Jamestown is a very good example. People got to Jamestown, and even the colony before that, Roanoke, were both sort of failures. Jamestown didn't really take off until the English government took control of the colony, and until they discovered that they could actually sell tobacco once they realized that people liked tobacco and it was addictive. But essentially, the colonies could fail, and if the colony failed, you would lose all your money that you invested in that colony. Or if the ship sank on the way, again, you're taking the risk that you might lose everything. But there are also benefits. The benefits is that individual members paid only a fraction of the total colonization cost. If the colony failed, investors lost only their small share, not all their wealth, but just the small part that they invested. If the colony thrived, then investors could share in the profits. So by sharing and distributing that risk, it makes it a little bit easier to do things that you wouldn't normally be able to do by yourself. Again, there are risks, but there are also benefits. And sometimes the benefits can really outbalance the risks, depending on how much that you've invested. So that's our basic understanding of the risks and benefits of capitalism. Again, this is something you're probably familiar with. We live in a capitalist society, and especially given our economy today, we have a better understanding of how risky things can be. But that's how capitalism works, and if it hadn't taken place in the early 1500s with the beginning of colonization, then a system that we live by today, the capitalist system in which we all participate and live in today, would never have had its start. So there you go. There's the origins of capitalism.